Welcome to DriverDTrains. Thanks for stopping by. I'm your host, DriverD. Our conductor and brakeman, Scratchy-C, is practicing some paw-eye coordination with the uncoupling stick. In my last video, I showed you how we can use the WiThrottle and Engine Driver apps with JMRI and DCC-EX to export our JMRI locomotive roster settings to DCC-EX to make it easier to run our trains. If you haven't already seen that video, be sure to check it out. In this video, we'll look at some different types of physical controllers we can use with JMRI and DCC-EX as throttles to operate our locomotives. Note that we will not be talking about traditional locomotive throttles in this video, but rather some lower-cost alternatives to those throttles. I will discuss how to use the Iowa-scaled engineering proto-throttle with JMRI and DCC-EX in a future video. In my next video, we'll look at some ways we can manage our JMRI locomotive rosters, as well as some of the additional ways that we can customize and configure JMRI. All of these videos are part of a series on using JMRI with DCC-EX to control our trains. This initial series of videos will focus on JMRI's DecoderPro app and throttles for running our locomotives. I'll come back to the PanelPro app and turnout control later. Be sure to check this video's description for links to the other videos in the series, as well as the various websites and products I mentioned here. Also, if you are enjoying the videos, please leave a comment and hit the like button. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Today's video is about thinking outside the boxcar, so grab your pointers and we'll see if we can teach an old cat some new tricks. Using physical controllers with JMRI and DCC-EX. Now that we've learned how to use JMRI's DecoderPro app to program our locomotives, and learned how to customize JMRI throttles and functions, and used the WiThrottle and Engine Driver apps with JMRI and DCC-EX to control our trains, let's look at some different types of physical controllers we can use as alternatives to a traditional model train throttle to run our locomotives. There are a number of different ways that physical devices can communicate with JMRI and DCC-EX so that we can use those devices as throttles to control our locomotives. For example, as we saw in my last video, both JMRI and DCC-EX include a WiThrottle server, so we can use devices that use the WiThrottle protocol to run our trains. Typically, this would mean using an app such as WiThrottle or Engine Driver on a smartphone or tablet. However, there are also some commercially available throttles that use the WiThrottle protocol, such as the TCS UWT50 and 100. We could even construct our own WiThrottle controller using readily available components and open source software. In addition to the WiThrottle protocol, DCC-EX also has its own DCC-EX native protocol. As I mentioned in my last video, the Engine Driver app can use the DCC-EX native protocol, as well as the WiThrottle protocol, to communicate with DCC-EX. And we have already sent commands to DCC-EX using its native protocol in both the Arduino IDE serial monitor, as well as the debug console in the EX WebThrottle app. In fact, the DCC-EX native protocol is what JMRI uses to communicate with DCC-EX, and as we will see later in this video, JMRI offers us a way to send DCC-EX commands using the DCC-EX native protocol by typing them on a command line. There are various other types of protocols that we could use to communicate with JMRI, and by extension DCC-EX, such as the Digitrax LocoNet protocol, which is popular in the model railroading community, but typically requires a hardware interface to use. However, perhaps the easiest way to communicate with JMRI and DCC-EX, or any other command station for that matter, using a physical device other than a smartphone app or commercial throttle is to use the keyboard shortcuts in JMRI Throttles that we explored in detail in video number 5C, using and customizing JMRI throttles. Using JMRI's keyboard shortcuts will allow us to use most any device that can connect to our computer as a throttle to control our trains. One important thing to note about this method is that it splits the typical functions of a model railroad throttle into two parts. The roster and track management functions of the throttle, including selecting which locomotives to run, setting up consists, and controlling turnouts and routes, is done in JMRI or using another throttle, while the control of our locomotive's speed, direction, and DCC decoder functions is done using our physical devices. Also, because using keyboard shortcuts is a one-way communication, the devices we use in this manner can't receive information back from JMRI, including the active locomotive, locomotive speed, and the status of the locomotive functions. However, because we can use multiple throttles simultaneously for the same locomotives, including JMRI throttles, as well as the WiThrottle and Engine Driver apps, the current status of our operating locomotives is always available to us in WiThrottle and Engine Driver, as well as in JMRI, while we control our trains using our physical devices. In a later video, I will show you how to configure DCC-EX to display that information on an LCD display connected to your DCC-EX command station. For this video, we will look at three different types of devices we can use to control our locomotives: wireless keyboards and number pads, a wireless drawing tablet controller, and a programmable Stream Deck control panel, nominally marketed to video streamers, but which can be used to control any computer application. Some of these devices you may already have. Some can be had for less than $20. Others cost nearly as much as, or even more than, a commercially available throttle, but can also be used in conjunction with other throttles to provide additional functionality and easy access to control over our locomotives and layout features. We'll look at how to use all of these devices to control our trains by using JMRI keyboard shortcuts. We'll look at each one separately, as well as how they can be used together and in conjunction with JMRI throttles and the WiThrottle and Engine Driver apps. We'll also look at how to control our trains with the DCC-EX native protocol in two different ways during the last part of this video, by using the Stream Deck controller as an example. One of the wonderful things about model railroading is that there is always more than one way to do something, whether it is constructing scenery, building a structure, or weathering rolling stock. Today we will look at some different ways of controlling our trains using physical devices with JMRI and DCC-EX. Let's get this hotshot rolling. Here are the pickups we'll be making today. First, we'll take a look at controlling our trains using simple wireless keyboards and number pads. Then we'll check out the Xencelabs Quick Keys wireless tablet controller. Finally, we'll look at three different ways to use an Elgato Stream Deck control panel to operate our locomotives and layout automations. And of course, we'll run some trains. Using physical controllers with JMRI and DCC-EX. Number 1. Wireless keyboards and number pads. The first type of device we will look at today is a wireless number pad. A wireless number pad is like a small wireless keyboard without the typewriter keys. While we can certainly use a full wireless keyboard to control our trains, and may choose to do so if we already have one available, they are less portable and harder to handle than a simple number pad. And thanks to JMRI's keyboard shortcuts, we don't need anything more than a number pad to control most of the features of our locomotives. Wireless number pads come in a variety of sizes. Some have just the basic 10-key portion of the number pad, while others include the navigation and arrow keys, and sometimes a few others. Wireless number pads also use different methods of wireless communication. Some use Bluetooth, while others use a 2.4 GHz wireless protocol with a USB dongle connected to our computer. For the purposes of this video, the communications technology doesn't matter. There are a number of inexpensive wireless number pads available, many for less than $20. I chose to purchase one that includes the navigation and arrow keys. As you will see in the video, I normally use a switching shunting type of throttle on my small D-saver layout. With this type of throttle, I don't need forward and reverse buttons to change the direction that my locomotives travel. However, when using a standard throttle, and even when using the switching shunting throttle, the arrow keys make it easier to change our locomotive's direction. To use the wireless number pad with JMRI and DCC-EX, or any other command station, we first need to select the locomotive or consist we want to control from our roster and open a JMRI throttle. If we want to be able to control more than one locomotive or consist, we can either open them in separate throttle windows or in separate throttle frames within the same window. We can then program some keyboard shortcuts for one or more keys on our number pad to cycle through the throttles. As I described in my video on using JMRI throttles, we can control our locomotives and many of their functions using just the keys on the numeric keypad. We can control our locomotive speed using the plus and minus keys, as well as the left and right arrow keys, and we can use the up and down arrow keys to change direction. By default, the asterisk on the number pad moves the throttle to idle, but I also added a keyboard shortcut for the enter key to do the same. Both the / key and the escape key serve as emergency stop buttons. The number keys on the keypad operate locomotive functions from 0 to 9, while the decimal point operates function 10. Unfortunately, some of the keys on this number pad actually perform 2 key presses, which confuses JMRI. So for example, the double 0 key just presses the 0 key twice, which cycles the headlight on and off, or off and on, rather than perform some other function. Nevertheless, if we program our most commonly used locomotive functions to be activated from function buttons 1 through 10, we may not need anything more than a wireless number pad to run our trains. And if we do need to control other functions not available from the number pad, we can do that in our JMRI throttle, or in the WiThrottle or Engine Driver apps set to the same locomotive. We can also use JMRI as well as WiThrottle or Engine Driver to keep track of our locomotive speed and active functions. And as I mentioned previously, we can control multiple locomotives by using our shortcuts to cycle through the different JMRI throttles. Now you might ask, why would we bother using a wireless number pad to control our locomotives when we could just use the WiThrottle and Engine Driver apps, which provide a lot more features? There are several reasons. First, we may want to use our phone for other things while running our trains, such as making calls, sending messages, or taking photos. We may also prefer the tactile feel of pushing physical buttons rather than tapping on a screen. And the muscle memory of pressing physical buttons makes controlling our trains easier to do without looking at the throttle. I find this particularly true during switching operations when I am carefully adjusting the locomotive speed, one speed step at a time. Finally, in my case, my phone weighs more than twice as much as the wireless number pad, and I have occasionally dropped it while trying to switch cars, which is not ideal. One drawback of the number pad with the navigation keys is that it is a little too large to use all of the controls with one hand. However, the number pad is so light, I can easily shuffle it from hand to hand without fear of dropping it, and can set it down without worry if I need to. And again, we can use the wireless number pad, the JMRI throttle, and our WiThrottle and Engine Driver apps all at the same time. So just having the number pad handy around the layout means we will always have a wireless throttle available if we need one. I would include a link to the number pad that I purchased in this video's description, except that it is no longer available. However, there are many other similar ones available online to choose from. Number 2. Xencelabs Quick Keys Wireless Tablet Controller. The next device we will look at today is called the Xencelabs Quick Keys Tablet Controller. This device works with Mac, Windows, and many Linux machines, but does not work on Raspberry Pi computers. The Vancouver, Washington-based Xencelabs, one of 3 independent brands of the Shenzhen, China company Hanvan Uji, sells the Quick Keys controller as an accessory for its professional pen drawing tablets, which directly compete with the industry leader Wacom and are used worldwide by graphic designers for digital illustration, photo editing, and animation. As such, the Quick Keys controller is a premium product with phenomenal build quality and top-notch software, and over the past year has become, far and away, my favorite way to operate my locomotives. The Quick Keys normally retails for $99 on Amazon, but regularly goes on sale. At the time of this recording, there is a coupon on Amazon for 20% off, lowering the price to $80. The size and weight of the device makes it easy to hold and operate one-handed. It is almost the same height as my phone, but 30% narrower and weighs just half as much. The Quick Keys features 8 programmable keys, 4 on each side, that have a satisfying clicky feel, which is just right for a device that we continually hold in our hand, where we can rest our thumb on the buttons without fear of unintentionally pressing one. Ironically, some graphic professionals who use the device resting on a table or mounted to the side of a tablet have wished for mushier keys with more key travel, but I think these are just right for a handheld train throttle. In addition, the 2 middle keys on each side of the controller feature a small indentation or bump that helps us feel the keys as we move our finger across them. As a result, the device is very easy to operate without needing to look at it most of the time. Each of the 8 keys can operate up to 5 separate functions, which means the device can operate up to 40 push-button functions in all, which we can use to control our trains and layout. In the middle of the device, between the keys, is a customizable OLED screen that can display a text label or name next to each key for each of that key's functions. A separate button at the bottom of the controller lets us cycle between up to 5 pages of functions and their corresponding text labels for the 8 function keys. At the top of the controller is a smooth-acting rotary encoder dial with a knurled edge and a dimple in the top surface for our finger. The dial is very stable and does not wobble when we press on it. It is also tall enough that we can turn it by gently rotating its knurled edge, which is handy for small movements. Like the function keys, the dial is programmable and can operate up to 4 pairs of functions for 8 functions total. While it might seem obvious that we would want to use the dial to control the speed of our locomotives, we can also use it for other purposes, such as cycling through the various locomotive throttles we have running or modifying the sound settings on our locomotive. A button in the center of the dial allows us to cycle through the 4 dial settings, and a customizable LED light under the dial allows us to choose a color to display for each setting. The Quick Keys connects to our computer using either a USB-C cable or wirelessly using a Bluetooth dongle, and has a long-life rechargeable battery that we can recharge using the included USB-C cable, and we can continue to use the device while it is charging. A slide toggle switch on the bottom edge of the controller allows us to turn it on and off, and it will automatically go to sleep if we don't use it for a while, and then wake up when we use it again. Xencelabs provides a high-quality carrying case for the controller, its dongle, and a USB cable. In addition to the premium quality hardware, the Quick Keys features very polished, top-notch configuration software. The software allows us to configure different settings on the device for each different application that we use, as well as global settings that we can use for all other applications, and it automatically switches between these settings when we change applications. For each application, we can configure all 5 sets of the 8 function keys, as well as all 4 sets of the dial settings. For each of these items, we can determine what actions they take. We can also enter the text labels shown in the OLED display for the keys, and the LED colors associated with each dial. Finally, we can adjust various device settings, including the screen brightness, the sleep timer, and even which direction on the controller is considered up. For my locomotive throttle, I have configured my quick keys as follows. On the first page of the function keys, I have placed all the locomotive actions and functions I use most often. These include the horn, short horn, brake, coupler, speed plus and minus, idle, and emergency stop functions. On the second page, I have keys for all the lighting functions: the bell, cab chatter, brake select, engine shutdown, and low volume sound mix. On the 4 dial settings, I have the locomotive speed control, prime mover RPM increase and decrease, sound controls, and JMRI locomotive throttle selection to switch between locomotives. And of course, I can use the quick keys with other apps too, besides JMRI, including Photoshop and the editing software I use to create these videos. While I think that the Xencelabs quick keys makes for a great locomotive controller when using JMRI throttles, it does have some limitations we should be aware of. Firstly, because the quick keys is not designed to be a train throttle and cannot receive messages back from JMRI, it cannot display information about our selected locomotive, such as its speed and which locomotive functions are active. Also, the function keys on the controller will always be the same, regardless of what locomotive we are running, unless we edit them in the Quick Keys software. With up to 5 separate pages of settings available at one time, we can set up options for perhaps 2 or 3 different types of locomotives from our roster at the same time, or else revert to the dumb throttle default of naming our function keys F1, F2, F3. And while we can use the quick keys to cycle between different locomotive throttles in JMRI so we can control more than one locomotive during an operating session, the function keys on the controller will not automatically change based on which locomotive we select. We will have to select the appropriate function key page manually using the button at the bottom of the controller. Ultimately, the quick keys works best when we can standardize our locomotive function settings and be aware that not every locomotive may have every feature shown on the controller. The quick keys also uses a custom Bluetooth dongle to connect to our computer wirelessly, so we will need to have that dongle in one of our computer's USB ports to use the device without a cable. And if we want to use the quick keys with more than one computer, we will need to transfer the dongle as well as the software settings from one machine to another. The quick keys also uses a rotary encoder dial rather than a traditional potentiometer knob. Personally, I much prefer this type of controller, as I typically use a switching, shunting style throttle on my small 1 foot by 6 foot D-Saver layout. I also run my locomotives with a lot of momentum and use the idle and brake functions to bring the locomotives to a stop, rather than manually turning the throttle dial to 0. However, none of these conditions is a requirement for enjoyably using the quick keys as a locomotive throttle. As I said, the quick keys has been my preferred go-to throttle over the past year. I much prefer to manage my locomotives and consists using JMRI and use the small, dedicated controller customized to my preferences to run my trains. As a side note, during my search for a controller to use with JMRI throttles to operate my locomotives, I looked at several other possibilities. Another device that I tried was the XP Pen Mini Key Dial. XP Pen is another one of the 3 independent brands under Han von Uji, and the mini key dial shares some similarities with the Xencelabs quick keys. The hardware quality of the mini key dial, while not up to the standards of the quick keys, is pretty good, but the wide, shallow dial is a bit wobbly, and the layout of the 10 buttons is somewhat awkward and harder to use as a locomotive throttle. The mini key dial uses the same configuration software as the quick keys, but does not offer as many features. And of course, the mini key dial does not have the OLED display or the color LED indicator for the dial. The price of the mini key dial is about half that of the quick keys, so it may be of interest to those on a budget. Ultimately, however, I found the quick keys to be well worth the extra cost. In addition to the mini key dial, I also looked at a bunch of so-called macro pads. One in particular that I spent some time thinking about is this 15-key pad with 3 dials. A number of variations of these are available from different sellers. This one got a positive review in a YouTube video. However, it still does not have any kind of screen, and the software to program it only runs on Windows. Nevertheless, it is wireless and might make a good trackside accessory for controlling some of our locomotive and layout functions. Which brings us to the third and final device for today. Number 3. Elgato Stream Deck. I'll state right from the outset that it doesn't make any sense to purchase a Stream Deck to use as a model train throttle unless we have a very specific use case, such as to control an automation or a very small section of a layout where we want to have buttons that can display text messages and graphics for an operator to respond to and perform very basic commands like start, stop, and blow horn. However, if we already have a Stream Deck or other comparable device, or purchase one for other uses, we can also use it to control our trains and layouts in a few interesting and different ways. The Elgato Stream Deck is a family of USB button control panels to integrate into our computer's operating system and various applications. Available in a variety of physical sizes, with prices ranging from $60 to $250, Stream Decks feature from 6 to 32 physical buttons, and on the Stream Deck Plus, a touch strip and 4 dials. Each of the buttons is illuminated by an LCD display and can be customized with its own image and text, and can be programmed to perform a myriad number of actions and functions that can change and update as the device is being used. There are also smartphone and tablet app versions of the Stream Deck that mimic the look of the physical devices and work the same way, although the free version is limited to just 6 buttons. The Stream Deck software is very powerful and allows us to create multiple pages of buttons, buttons that perform multiple actions, buttons that switch back and forth between different actions, and much more. Stream Decks are very popular in the video streaming and online gaming communities, and there are numerous plugins available for software applications that are popular in those communities, including video streaming and editing software, social media websites such as YouTube, Discord, and Twitch, lighting and sound controllers, and office productivity software, including business and video conferencing applications such as PowerPoint, Zoom, and Slack. The plugins provide a two-way communications channel between the Stream Deck and the application, allowing information to be sent in both directions. However, we can use the Stream Deck to control any application, including JMRI, regardless of whether there is a plugin, by using keyboard menu commands, shortcuts, and other macros. We'll look at 3 distinct ways of using the Stream Deck with JMRI and DCC-EX. The version of the Stream Deck that we will use today is the Stream Deck Plus with the 4 dials and LCD touch strip. However, any other Stream Deck could perform the same actions using buttons. The first technique we will look at is to use the Stream Deck in the same way that we used the wireless keypad and the Xencelabs quick keys, as a keypad to use JMRI keyboard shortcuts. However, unlike with those devices, we can go one step further and use the Stream Deck software to organize different screens for each locomotive. Then for each locomotive, we can have additional screens for specific types of functions, such as lights and sounds in this example. Of course, we also want buttons, or dials in this case, to control things like our locomotive's speed, direction, prime mover RPM, idle, brakes, and emergency stop. And we can add graphic icons to the buttons to show each function. And if we really want to get creative, we can create macros in the Stream Deck software to perform a series of actions. For example, we could create a locomotive startup sequence that includes starting up the prime mover, turning on the lights, ringing the bell, honking the horn twice, and rolling out. Or a shutdown sequence that does the reverse.
Crew packs, ice and water. Alright, thanks. Sold Silver Spring crew will meet you there when they get out of their paperwork stuff.
Of course, there are limits to what we can do using just JMRI keyboard shortcuts, but we can take it a step further by sending DCC-EX commands in its native language protocol and use the Stream Deck to send those commands to trigger DCC-EX automations, turnouts, routes, and even run our trains. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, JMRI offers us a way to send DCC-EX commands using the DCC-EX native protocol by typing the commands on a command line. To view this command line, we go to the roster window so that it is active and then choose Send DCC++ command from the DCC-EX menu. As a reminder, the name of this menu will depend on the name we gave our connection to DCC-EX when we first set up and configured JMRI, so yours will probably look different from what is shown here. On the command line, we can tell DCC-EX to start an automation by using the /start command along with the automation ID or locomotive and route number. We can have the Stream Deck organize and remember all of these commands so we don't have to. We just need to push a button. But we can also use the DCC-EX command line in JMRI to directly control our trains without using the JMRI throttle or its keyboard shortcuts at all. Instead, each push button can send a command to DCC-EX in its native language protocol to control a train, operate a turnout, or set a route. Due to some limits in the Stream Deck software, in order to use the dials on the Stream Deck Plus for this requires some system macros to perform some text substitution. And teaching DCC-EX to increase or decrease a locomotive speed without specifying the actual speed step requires some edits to the EX command station sketch in the Arduino IDE. But once those are done, we can independently control 4 locomotives at a time on each page and swipe between pages on the Stream Deck to control as many locomotives as we want. And none of this requires any additional hardware other than the Stream Deck or accessing any software that isn't on our computers. And while the Stream Deck device needs to be connected to our computer with a USB cable in order to work, the Stream Deck app on our phone or tablet lets us have some of these controls available in a handheld format. There is one other way we can use a Stream Deck to control DCC-EX using its native command language protocol, and that is with a Stream Deck plugin that includes a module designed specifically for DCC-EX. The plugin is called BitFocus Companion and includes a module that can control a DCC-EX command station. We can read more about this module on the DCC-EX website and on GitHub. Unfortunately, the plugin module's functions are a bit limited, and it hasn't been updated in 3 years. If anyone with some time on their hands is listening, it would be great to have a proper Stream Deck plugin for both DCC-EX and JMRI, and maybe even a Stream Deck WiThrottle plugin. Just saying. These 3 examples, using a wireless keypad, the Xencelabs quick keys, and the Stream Deck controller, just scratch the surface for how we can control our trains using JMRI and DCC-EX. Be sure to visit the JMRI and DCC-EX websites for more ideas and inspiration. Number 4. Run some trains. Well, today's run was not our usual route. It had a few twists and turns, but we saw some new sights and made it back on time. And now that we've looked at a few different ways to control our locomotives with JMRI and DCC-EX, let's go run some trains. All aboard! What's next? Managing locomotive rosters in JMRI. We're getting near the end of this first series of videos on JMRI, but there are still one or two more topics to cover. In my next video, we'll wrap up the series on JMRI by looking at some tips and tricks for how we can manage our JMRI locomotive rosters. We'll also look at some of the additional ways we can customize and configure JMRI. After that, we'll take a break from talking about command stations and control software and just look at running some trains as I introduce you to my D-Saver switching puzzle app and show you how to enjoy hours of switching operations on a tiny 1 foot by 6 foot HO scale layout. After that, we'll look at some additional hardware projects for DCC-EX, such as adding a second LCD and OLED display and assembling an EX fast clock. We'll also look at some ways to modify the EX command station software, as well as explore more DCC-EX automations in EX Rail. We might even do some rail fanning out on the High Line. So until then, thanks for watching. Well, Scratchy, are you ready to uncouple some cars? You already did. All aboard!